On the international stage, the South African government has gone out of its way to provoke the United States and has not been a neutral actor by any stretch of the imagination. From openly taking a side in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, bringing the ICJ genocide case against Israel, an increasingly cozy relationship with China alongside an increasingly hostile relationship with the United States, and it has been confirmed that South Africa is among the countries in the United Nations that is most likely to vote against the United States. In 2018, South Africa's ambassador to Venezuela announced that South Africa would provide military support to the Venezuelan government to fend off what he believed was a threatening US invasion. He later retracted his comments and apologized. In 2019, the ANC sent a senior delegation on a solidarity visit to provide moral support to Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. The South African government's stance on Venezuela is not surprising when one considers that it has repeatedly endorsed dictators, authoritarian regimes, and human rights abusers, including Muammar Gaddafi, Robert Mugabe, Hugo Chavez, Omar al-Bashir, Fidel Castro, Stalin, Lenin, and even Mao Zedong. In 2008, the ANC proposed that the streets between which the American embassy is situated be renamed Fidel Castro and Che Guevara streets, respectively. In February 2019, the governments of the US, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, and Switzerland wrote to the President of South Africa, warning him that failure to act against corruption would hamper his bid to draw foreign investment to South Africa. The ANC's response was to lash out, describing the letter as a threat from imperialist forces and latter-day colonialists. The South African government also plans to rename the road on which the US consulate is located after the terrorist Leila Khalid. In January 2020, members of the ANC and its alliance partner, the South African Communist Party, protested outside the US Embassy in Pretoria, chanting, "One bullet, one American."
One American! Yes! One bullet, one American!
Now joining me to illuminate and shine a light on some of the happenings that have been happening on the international stage regarding South Africa, the United States, the wider West, is Jaco Kleynhans, the Head of International Liaison for the Solidarity Movement. And Jaco, it's been a very busy past month or so. This started around the 2nd of February, this episode that we're now experiencing, but it has a much longer lead up to it, almost a 30-year lead up to it. Can you just sketch us the picture, the ANC in power? How did they approach diplomacy with the West, the world, just South Africa on the global stage?
Yes, I think the mistake that many people and many analysts made over the last few weeks is to think that there's just simply a crisis in the relationship, the diplomatic relations between South Africa and the US, and that has all to do with Donald Trump becoming president, 47th president of the United States, and so it's a very isolated kind of crisis in the relationship. The reality is that since the ANC came to power in 1994, there were a perception in the West of what South Africa is supposed to be, and what the ANC did in practice. If you read the speech of Bill Clinton to the South African Parliament in 1998, that was interesting enough the only case where an American president delivered a speech to a seating of the South African, both houses of the South African Parliament. He spoke about the fact that South Africa is an unaligned country with great relations with both the West and the East, a country that plays a major role in Africa, actually a leading role in Africa, also to build bridges between the West, you can say America, and the rest of Africa. And he spoke about the role of South Africa as somewhere between a superpower, which we're not. We're not America or the European Union or China, but we're also not, or that were the perception in the 1990s, we were not just a typical middle power, a smaller nation, you know, only playing a role in a certain geographical area. So there were really a a thinking amongst Western politicians and leaders in the 1990s that South Africa can be a great example of a democracy, a Western-like democracy in the third world, bridging the gap between the developed West and other parts of the world. And Bill Clinton spoke in that speech in 1998 of a special relationship between South Africa and America. Now, I think over the years, and that's many years, like you've said, we saw the challenges with that special relationship, where the Americans then, after Bill Clinton went back to the United States in 1998, started to put things in place to do their part to implement the special relationship. And one of them were 2 years later, less than 2 years later, the adoption of the African Growth and Opportunities Act in the American Congress, opening up America's markets to South African products, but also products from other African countries, on a level that we as South Africa never experienced with any other country. We don't have the kind of access to the American market that we have in the European market, the Chinese market, the Indian market, any other market, but also the level of foreign direct investment that came to South Africa then in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, and we saw the results of that. We saw the high economic growth in the early 2000s, the years of Thabo Mbeki as South African president. That was all built on a perception of South Africa as a non-aligned country. South Africa as a country that will build that bridge. Then in the last, I would say, 15 years, especially since Jacob Zuma became president, after the Thabo Mbeki years, the Americans and even some Europeans, even people from countries like Japan and Australia, other countries, became really concerned. In the first place, with the levels of corruption, the state capture, that was very simple, but they also became aware of the fact that South Africa likes to say one thing and do something very differently. So you will hear from every South African president on visits to the White House or visits to the European Union or London or wherever they will go. We're an unaligned country. We build these bridges. We are the leader in Africa. And then when they get back to South Africa, they say and do different things. You know, they build strong relations with countries and groups that are the enemies of Western countries. You think of groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, but even on the African continent, you know, the fact that the South African government just more than a year ago had meetings with the Rapid Support Forces from Sudan, a group that were involved in a genocide in 2004 in the Darfur area of Sudan. The Americans started asking questions, you know, and they really started asking questions after the war broke out in Ukraine. And then the Americans started looking into South Africa's relations, not only with Russia. Russia is maybe even one small point of the problem, but Iran, China, many other groups. On the one hand, but on the other hand, the complete incompetence of our diplomatic service also. If you look at what are left of the South African embassies in many countries, in Vienna, in Austria, where we had one of our greatest embassies, in Washington, D.C., in London, in Brussels. The number of really competent diplomats still working in those embassies, engaging with other countries, you know, that's just for me a confirmation that South Africa didn't really did its part in ensuring very good relations with those countries. I was last year in November in Washington D.C. at an event where there were, I think, 9 or 10 of the 100 senators in the same room. And I was standing next to a woman and we started talking, and she was the ambassador from Tanzania, African ambassador there, engaging with American senators. And she asked me, am I from the South African embassy? I said, no, I don't have anything to do with the diplomatic service. She said, oh, well, that makes sense because you guys are always absent. So it was both a case of just being absent, not doing our work, but also being very dishonest. And South Africa and the ANC government here, specifically the ANC government, I think their dishonesty is now exposed. What happened with Donald Trump, and since Trump came back to the White House, we saw how the dishonesty of South African foreign policy have been exposed. It's out there, people can see it, and they can see that, yes, you've always been saying to the West, oh yeah, you know, we're unaligned, you know, keep up this great relationship, but then what we're doing and what we're saying behind your backs, quite something different.
And that's all come to a head now in the past month or so, which started in about the 2nd of February when Donald Trump made his post on social media almost as the first warning shot. And from the Solidarity Movement side and AfriForum side, we warned people that this is not the pinnacle, this is not the wave hitting, this is the warning. There, you could very clearly see that Donald Trump is sending a message that you have to come to the negotiating table now, otherwise there's going to be big trouble. Yes. And that big trouble then happened. In the past month, we've seen countless developments in regards to the situation and the crisis just simply worsening, all worsening in South Africa's, against South Africa's interests. And a lot of this is due to just reckless extremist rhetoric and behavior by ANC officials. So let's start off at the beginning. 2nd of February, Donald Trump makes his post that he is now going to launch an investigation into the very bad things happening in South Africa, specifically threats to private property rights, discriminatory laws, and the like. And that's where it starts. Just take us through what then happened next.
Yes. Again, and I just want to say this because you're making a very important point. Solidarity and AfriForum has been warning the South African government that there's something coming for years. We saw that, you know. We were in Washington, D.C. talking about AGOA, the trade agreement, in September 2023. And I saw all the warning signs, you know, because senators were telling me, you know, we visited the South Africa earlier, I think it was in May 2023. We're very concerned about things happening in your country. You must tell your government. They must engage with us.
And this is still under the Biden administration.
That was under the Biden administration. It was not only Republicans, it was also Democrats who were really concerned. Democrats who had a very, very good relationship with South Africa for many years. Then last year in November, I went to America again, and then it was even more extreme, you know, because in those 14 months that passed, there were a bill in the American Congress, there were public hearings in the American Congress about the relationship between South Africa and America, and that need to be reviewed. South Africa was absent, arrogantly absent from all those discussions, from all those processes. There was no there wasn't really a South African ambassador in Washington for 2 years. I mean, she was mostly absent. So all of that happened. Then they made the decision to appoint an anti-Western, anti-American ambassador just before Donald Trump came back to the White House. So President Ramaphosa knew that Donald Trump was voted in. He was elected on the 5th of November last year as the 47th American president. Then he made the decision to appoint Ibrahim Rasool as the ambassador to Washington, someone who was outspoken against Trump, who made serious allegations against Trump in 2017, were outspoken in favor of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And then they made sure that he arrived 3 days before Trump's inauguration in D.C. so that Joe Biden could just stamp his approval, and Rasool was the ambassador. And then when Trump entered the White House, there were people working for him in his new administration who were very much focused on South Africa. They had big dockets available. And it's not dockets that we gave to them, not at all. It's dockets that were compiled by very good researchers in the American Congress over the last 3 years. And Donald Trump received this dockets, and he was already very much focused on South Africa. I think that's also something that many of these commentators don't have an idea. These people who write in the media and talk on radio, they don't have an idea. Donald Trump was reading about South Africa for the last, I would say, 6-7 years intensively. You know, he's very well informed about South Africa. He knows everything that happened in South Africa over the last 6-7 years. He actually developed quite an interest in South Africa. I was told that, and he received a docket on all these extreme things happening in South Africa, but all these things, remarkable remarks that politicians made against him as a person, but also against America, against the West. And that was the reason then why he sent out that message on Truth Social. Also because one of his staff members told him about the Expropriation Act that President Ramaphosa signed. And he wanted to send a warning message to the South African government. So he sent out the Truth Social message to tell Ramaphosa and the government, there's trouble coming. You must do something.
This post is not the trouble.
This is not the trouble. Because remember what I'm telling other people is that, remember what Trump did with, for instance, for example, with Colombia. He just announced 25% import duties on products from Colombia. And then they said, oh my word, okay, we must allow the illegal immigrants to come back to Colombia. Trump didn't do that with South Africa. He wanted to warn South Africa, the South African government, on there will be consequences, you know. And that's what there was many of these warning signs over the last few weeks.
Pretty much sending the message, come to the negotiating table, let's make a deal.
Absolutely, absolutely, because that's the Trump style. That's what Trump does, you know. I mean, if you just look since the 22nd of January, if I'm correct, no, the 20th of January when Trump was inaugurated, you had a delegation. The first delegation from Africa was from the Kenyan government. William Ruto sent a very good delegation, also very wisely including opposition parties, also the main opposition party in Kenya in his delegation. Kenya, I mean, their economy is growing at 6 to 7% every year, and it's only based on increased exports to America. If you look at the increase in Kenyan exports to America last year, it's something, you know. Then Rwanda sent a delegation within the first week. We recently saw that the president of Botswana was in Washington, D.C. There's all kinds of plans from the Americans to make huge investments in these countries, but also in Zambia. They have a very good relationship with Hakainde Hichilema, the president of Zambia. Senegal, very good example also. All these African countries knew how to deal with Donald Trump. They went to Washington, they made deals, they said the right things, they did the right things. But again, after the Truth Social message from Trump, we saw again the same kind of arrogance, the same kind of leftist extremism from the ANC, from people in South Africa. And then came the executive order on the 7th of February that Trump signed, again sending a stronger warning message, but again without economic sanctions. So Trump do believe that partnership is still possible, but at the moment we are very, very far away from that. And then we saw all the further and further warning shots from not only the White House, but you also saw the messages from someone like Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Jim Risch, who's the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. There's been so many warning shots, and South Africa, the South African government, did nothing, in my view, in the last few weeks to try and fix this relationship.
And with the signing of the executive order, that's where the real trouble then starts. That's the real consequences of your actions, the chickens coming home to roost. In addition to that, there's also an announcement by Marco Rubio regarding G20. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yes, and I mean, President Ramaphosa, when he gets on a plane, and he loves to fly around the world because he still views South Africa. And I think that's important to understand within this context of the G20 summit that will happen in South Africa this year in November. Within that context, President Ramaphosa still views himself somehow as one of the most important global leaders. And he still views South Africa somehow as one of the great power players in the world. For a few reasons, because he gets invited to some important events, sometimes to the G20 summit, but you saw recently not that much anymore. But South Africa is still part of the G20. Technically, if you do an analysis, South Africa is not supposed to be part of the G20 anymore. I mean, we've lost so many positions. I mean, I think we're now the 38th or 39th biggest economy in the world. So we don't belong anymore within the G20 of countries, the greatest economies in the world. But we're there. Every country gets an opportunity to to have the summit, to present the G20 summit, but somehow President Ramaphosa think it makes us very important, that it was given to us because we did something right, So South Africa hosts the G20 summit this year, and in that context, President Ramaphosa goes around the world and he loves to talk about being chair of the G20. That is for him something major, something really, really important. And I do believe that it's a great opportunity for South Africa, and we must all share the hope for the opportunities that we can get as a country from hosting the G20 summit. But we're making all the mistakes because you need to get all the partners on board. And there was a few very difficult G20 summits in the last few years. I remember 2 years ago it was in Indonesia, and how well the president of Indonesia played the very, very difficult situation with President Joe Biden of America saying, but he will not attend the G20 summit if Vladimir Putin of Russia is there. And even before that became an issue, Indonesia ensured that Putin will not be there, and he played it off very well. But Ramaphosa is not doing that, So what we're losing now, we're already at the first meeting of the ministers of foreign affairs of G20 countries. Marco Rubio, like you said, then announced that he will not attend that meeting. Then a week later, we had the summit in Cape Town of the ministers of finance of the G20 countries. Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary or Minister of Finance, didn't attend that meeting. And at this stage, I think there's no reason to believe that Donald Trump will be at the G20 summit in November. So I think there's a growing possibility that there will be a controversy around the G20 summit. It will be very controversial, and that will not play in the favor of South Africans. We really need a good G20 summit. Let's be honest, our economy, I can't remember when we had proper economic growth in South Africa, not in the last 15 years. If the economy grow with 1.5% one year, it just retract again the next year by 1.5%. We're just getting poorer and poorer as South Africans, but also as a country. Unemployment increased over the last 15 years. So we really need a strong G20 summit where we can present South Africa to the rest of the world as a country where you can invest in, where big companies can come and they can do business here. They can do business in the rest of Africa, but with South Africa as their foothold. For that you need property rights, you need good proper financial systems, you need trust in a solid government that deliver good infrastructure so that you can import and export, you can transport, you have good communication infrastructure, all the basics that you see in countries like Indonesia that's growing at 6-7% every year, but that you also see in Rwanda. If you go to Kigali in Rwanda, you see all these European companies building their African head offices in Kigali because all the right things are there. South Africa is not doing that at the moment. So I think what Marco Rubio did was also again sending a warning by not attending the meeting, because that people can forget about that, But if you don't deal then with that issue, then the next step will be that the American president will also not attend the summit. But again, like we've seen with the very long list of issues the last few weeks, the government, the reaction from the government is exactly the opposite than what the Americans hoped for.
And in an example of a decentralized diplomacy, the Solidarity Movement and AfriForum, the largest Afrikaner organizations in South Africa, sent a delegation to the United States and talked to some very important people there. What were the details of the Solidarity Movement AfriForum delegation visit? The who did you meet? The what did you talk about? The why did you go?
Yes, I think first, why did we go, because that's what people ask us. I think in the first place, Ernst, we started with International Liaison in 2004. So it's been 21 years. Over 21 years, we built a broad network of people, especially they're now in America, but also in Europe and other countries. But in America, for 21 years, a broad network of people in politics, think tanks, in the media, not only in Washington, D.C., but also in capitals like Austin in Texas, Lansing, Michigan, Columbia, South Carolina. I can go on and on, So we as the Solidarity Movement, Solidarity and AfriForum has a broad network of contacts. And now that Donald Trump is in the White House, many of the people that we've known for many years work in the White House and the State Department and in the Foreign Relations Committees, because the Republicans now control the Senate and the House of Representatives. Many of these people that I've known for maybe 15, 16 years, they will not send a delegation very soon. Our information also indicated that the South African embassy also had no access, really. Maybe very junior people in Congress, someone answering the telephone, at least, but no one senior was talking to Ibrahim Rasool as the South African ambassador, and we were really concerned. We were worried because at the end of the day, our members, our communities will be very negatively influenced if South Africa is kicked out of AGOA, and we can't export more than 1,000 different products anymore without any duties. Because Europe is very difficult. I've been in negotiations with the European Union, and then you always end up talking to the people from Spain who don't want us to export our oranges to Europe. We want to export oranges to the Netherlands and Belgium, but the Spanish people make it difficult for us. There's always been those challenges. The American market is an easy market. It's a huge market. It's a wealthy market. But what AGOA did was to make it a very, very easy market. Accessible, easy, not so much regulated. And today, yes, 40% of Western Cape agricultural exports go to America. So if South Africa must lose our access to AGOA, I think we will have 250,000 job losses. We will have farmers going bankrupt immediately because they made a lot of debt to put the necessary infrastructure in place. Car manufacturing factories will close down in the Eastern Cape especially, but also in Gauteng. Some of our companies in the Vaal Triangle will have to close down, chemical companies that export to America. So we were very concerned about all of that. On the other hand, the American president, mentioned in his executive order the Afrikaner. It was the first time in more than 100 years that an American president acknowledged the Afrikaners as a people in something like an executive order. That's major. That's very important. And we also went to Washington to say that we're very thankful for that acknowledgement, and we want to build on that relationship, the relationship between Afrikaners and the Trump government, the Trump administration in America. And despite all of the things written and said over the last few weeks, it's a fact that the Solidarity movement, Solidarity and AfriForum and all the other organizations in the movement are by far the biggest representative of Afrikaners in South Africa. There's no other organization coming close to that. So that was very important to build on that relationship, to take that issue further, but then also to talk about the practical consequences of the diplomatic crisis, and we at the access, we were meeting at the White House, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the State Department, all the different think tanks, from the Heritage Foundation, the Hudson Institute, the Cato Institute, we can all mention all of them, the American media. We do have that access as organizations to do exactly that. And well, since then it became very clear that the White House, or that the South African embassy in Washington and the union buildings, the South African government don't have much access left with not only the Trump administration, but broadly the American government in Washington.
The expelling of the ambassador, you've touched on it earlier, but I just want to get all the details from you again in regards to what's happened here and what are the implications of it.
Yeah, I mean, it was completely irresponsible of Ibrahim Rasool as an ambassador to at a conference of the Mapungubwe Foundation in Johannesburg, but he was speaking online from Washington, to make the kind of accusations against the Trump administration. He was even talking about Afrikaners as being part of a Trump-led kind of supremacist Western movement, right-wing or white supremacist kind of movement. If you read into his text, you know, to make that kind of points at a forum where you know that people will report on that. You know, it was it was irresponsible. It was completely arrogant, but also I think it indicated to us his very extreme background, but also his background as being a very incompetent politician. And people were not willing to say that. It was unbelievable to me when in January we found out that Rasool was appointed as ambassador, and you saw people in the media saying, oh, but this is a great appointment, you know, and Rasool has all the experience because he was our ambassador in Washington in the past, and great. Rasool is a terrible politician. He made a mess of the Western Cape. He was premier of the Western Cape, the last ANC premier. That was a complete mess, you know. I mean, that was a time where the Western Cape was mismanaged. It also, it was the beginning of the end for the ANC in the Western Cape. There was serious accusations of corruption against Ibrahim Rasool. His first term as ambassador during the Obama years were a complete failure. It indicated to us the loss of skills within the South African embassy in Washington, where most of the really competent people left the embassy. He really left the embassy without real influence in the American politics. And then for President Ramaphosa to decide to send him back to Washington, you know, I mean, that was already for me clear in January that that was not a very good decision. Then he was so irresponsible in this things that he said at this online conference, and I think there was not really much options left to the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. You know, he could call him in and talk to Rasool, but what do you say to him? You can, on the other hand, phone the South African Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ronald Lamola, but there were no relationship at that point between Rubio and Lamola. There was also no relationship between President Trump and President Ramaphosa. So I think that just confirmed to us how bad the relationship is, but it also confirmed to us where this ANC-led government, where they stand in terms of trying to fix this relationship. Because if they were in a process of reviewing the relationship, of drafting proposals to the Trump administration on how to fix things, you know, then Rasool would not be as irresponsible to say what he did.
Mm. And then another story that also happened the past month has been a treason investigation opened against that Solidarity Movement and AfriForum delegation in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's preposterous, you know, that they want to have this case of treason against us. It's very clear that they want to use that as a stick, you know. They want to hit us with that. There's no legal basis for any such case. So there's absolutely no legal basis, but they want to intimidate us. It's used as a method to intimidate not only the delegation of the Solidarity Movement, but also our organizations and our members. You know, they want to tell us, stay in your corner. AfriForum, stay in your corner. Solidarity, stay in your corner. Do what we expect from you to do. Say what we expect from you to do. Until you step out of your corner, we will hit you with a stick. The problem is with this case of treason against us is that there's a very high level of awareness in the Trump administration about that. The Americans are very concerned about that. They believe that that is just more proof of the complete irresponsible attitude of the Ramaphosa-led government. I think what is important is that we're in a very interesting time currently globally in the world. There's this big power play between the US and China. South Africa is somewhere in the middle of that. That creates great opportunities for countries like South Africa. We see how other countries are taking up those opportunities. India, or by far, I think, from the BRICS countries, the country who plays this idea of being truly unaligned, very, very well. There's still an opportunity to fix the diplomatic relations with America. It will be very, very difficult, and I think what is important, on the one hand, to put extremely tough pressure on the South African government from within South Africa, but also from outside South Africa, but also to keep up this engagement with the Americans. You know, we need to protect the rights of our people, and I think there's still great examples of how that is possible. The Trump administration is people say, they use the term a transactional administration as if that is something bad. I don't think that is something bad. I think what Trump is doing is he's working with individual countries, and that's why there's even a possibility that AGOA as an act may not survive this year. That the Trump administration will say we're rather going to go into different trade relations with every single African country, and then there's great opportunities for African countries who play it right with the Trump administration.
If you want to support AfriForum and our facts-based analysis and our facts-based campaigns, you can become a member by following the link on the screen and the link in the description of this video. Thank you very much for watching. Share this video far and wide, and thank you very much for standing with AfriForum and the truth in regards to South Africa and those people fighting to make a real difference.